To begin with the exhibition, we're standing next to a star that was made by Lorena Robledo of Amazing Piñatas here in Los Angeles. And the show is really about the ways that piñatas are very much an art form that has been under-recognized in terms of the art world, but it has hundreds and hundreds of years of history. So that is an aspect of the show that we really want to spotlight. And piñatas are obviously a part of so many of our lives and become these markers for all these important occasions, birthdays and other kinds of celebrations, holidays, and are a continuing cultural traditional craft form that really also has a very contemporary significance. So that's the overarching focus of the exhibition, but the star is really the perfect starting point for the show, because the star is a traditional piñata shape that signifies, traditionally they have seven points, signifying the 7 deadly sins. And the origins of the piñata, which are not truly ever documented in terms of solid text and history, but are more kind of oral, and what scholars have kind of gleaned from the history is that it goes all the way back to China, and Marco Polo visiting China in the 13th century and seeing Chinese New Year celebrations where they would make ceramic vessels that would be filled with seeds that were shattered, and those seeds inside these vessels that were shattered in these celebrations would then be planted. So it was also kind of a celebration of harvesting and agriculture. But that was transported to Western Europe, to Italy, then to Spain, and then the missionaries, we believe, brought it as a tool for indoctrination of the Aztecs in Mexico. And that's really where things took off in terms of piñatas as a tradition. And so that's where we really begin. So this hundreds of years of history is really the starting point for the show. And the show really looks at how modern artists and piñata makers are continuing to adapt that tradition in all kinds of new ways. So we're going to start with our window installation, which is a piece created by Isaías Rodriguez. And he's an originally born in LA artist who's now in Central California. And he created this installation specifically for the show. It's called Resilience. And these are 225 monarch butterflies, all handmade piñatas, but they're obviously palm-sized. They're very small compared to the scale of most piñatas we think about. And Isaías chose to make these for this piece because of a number of reasons. Monarchs being migratory, coming up all the way from Mexico through North America, and looking at that for one, from that, what that signifies, and the struggles that they're having more and more in terms of environmental issues, but also symbols of dreamers. And that significance was very important for him. But these also have a very personal meaning in that he lost his older sister earlier this year. And she loved butterflies, and he had made one for her at one point in her life. And also he talks about being at a memorial service for her, and he noticed a monarch that came fluttering by where they were. And it kind of made it very clear to him that he needed to memorialize her through these butterflies. So that's the starting point for the show, is really showing how artists are interpreting piñatas in completely new and innovative ways. And also, I should mention, in terms of Isaías, he also goes by the little piñata maker. And he specifically makes piñatas that are usually palm-sized and can be held in your hand and carried with you. And so really kind of flipping the scale of the piñata to make it more intimate and give it more personal meaning, in that it's an object that you can hold and touch. One thing that we'll be talking more about in the show is the idea of piñatas that are not ever intended to be smashed. And now we're looking at a piece by Roberto Benavidez, who is an artist who's originally from Texas and has lived in Los Angeles for many years now. And he started into the world of piñatas really as a sculptor. working in bronze, and quickly after school decided to transfer his interest in sculpture into the medium of paper. So he makes these incredibly detailed and ornate creatures, beasts, as we're looking at right now. The piece in front of me is called Javelina Girl, and the pieces behind me are his illuminated piñatas. So Roberto takes a lot of inspiration from illuminated manuscripts, and he turns a lot to art history to think about creatures and fantasy beings that may or may not have any history or pre-existence, but he uses those as a launching point, and then he obviously fills in the blanks with a lot of his own creativity of what these creatures might look like. His process is Pinata based, but also a different twist. He obviously, there's a lot of detailed patterns in his pieces. Those are all working with paper processes that he's really invented to get that kind of patterning and detail, which is so dense and so precise and meticulous. And he also works with papers that he finds are particularly malleable for what he's trying to do. So Italian metallic papers, papers from China in some cases, and really to give these creatures their animation. They really have this life. And so as you see, they are suspended, as would be a piñata, but of course these would never be intended to be smashed. So I think for a lot of the artists in the show, it's the idea that piñatas are this valuable and yet undervalued art form, and flipping the idea of making them smashable and ephemeral into something permanent. What does that signify? So a lot of imagination in Roberto's creatures, and color and detail. We're going to take a look at a newer group of his sculptural piñatas. These are his hybrid illuminated piñatas. And so you see in this group, which is slightly smaller in scale, and we purposely, I wanted to display these on pedestals and under vitrines to recontextualize how we look at piñatas. So in this series, he's obviously doing more of a smash up of the idea of what traditional piñatas look like. So the donkey, the kind of animal figures that the burro, that are more traditional piñata creatures, but combining them with these very fantastical beings that he's envisioned. So, and again, really very strong in terms of the ideas of who these creatures might be, and creating this whole kind of fantasy world around the piñata. The paper itself is very delicate and fragile, and also that kind of, I think, flips the idea of a piñata being something that is this duality of something that's durable, but also not intended to be a long-term object. He's really kind of switching that up and taking it into a new realm. Roberto has also been working with piñatas in a two-dimensional way. And I think this piece is a great example, along with how he really began, was looking at what he calls his piñata fringe, which are the triangular, he has various shapes that he will cut the paper into, all of which, of course, is hand cut and hand placed on all of his creatures. But he was looking at the extra bits of his fringe that he had, and he created a series of piñatas based on Rothko, but really about color combination. And that led him to working with the piñata in terms of paper, fringe, layer, texture, pattern, and into the two dimensions. So this show also touches on how piñatas can be two-dimensional, which I think defies a lot of people's expectations, but there are several artists across the country who are working with the piñata as a two-dimensional concept. So this is a piece that that Roberto made recently. This is actually a landscape of a beach on one of the Channel Islands here off the coast of California, close to us. And again, he's really able to get, I think, the quality of the light on this. This is one of the more isolated islands, not populated islands close to us. And I think he's able to capture the quality of the air, the light very well in terms of this piece with his Pinata technique. So the next piece I will talk about is by Josue Ramirez, who is an artist in Texas. So the show spans artists who are across the country. We have a large percentage of artists who are here in California, where Pinatas are sort of a very strong, it's a strong community for Pinata making, and then a natural conclusion would be that artists would then riff off of what the Pinatas are conceptually. But several of the artists in the show are also in Texas. Josue is one of them. This is one of his Pinata people costumes. And Josue creates these and then also does performances in these costumes that are really about movement. He often does them in open environmental spaces. So there's a lot of motion and wind, and the texture of the paper is able to really billow in those spaces and follow his movement and create this kind of otherworldly creature. Josue is usually using his Pinatas to comment on Latinx identity in many cases, and the sense of being an outsider in some ways, but also I think there's a very joyful element to watching his costumes in motion. And like most of these pieces in the show, color is essential and gives them so much vibrancy, and I think it is immediately what draws a lot of people into these pieces. So so that's a whole series of work that he has done, is create these costumes. Going to move on to the back of our space. So first we have another two-dimensional Pinata, which is by Justin Favela. And I just want to mention before I go on that as I'm talking, please feel free to type into the chat any questions that you have, and I will happily address those probably at the end of this tour. And you'll also have a chance, if you prefer to ask them live, that would be wonderful too. But just want to throw that out there. As the questions come up, please pop them in there. So Justin is in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he has been doing commissions of Pinatas in various locations across the country at this point, museum commissions. He's done a whole slew of incredible projects, usually large scale and usually site specific. And so this is a smaller scale project for Justin, but gives a great sense of what he's doing in terms of expanding what Pinatas can be, and very focal artist in terms of the movement to use Pinatas as an art form. This is actually based on a painting by a 19th century Mexican artist named Jose Maria Velasco, and this is actually very much a clear interpretation of that painting. Velasco is known for a lot of landscapes, and also the idea of specifically Mexican geography and elevating that in terms of the tradition of landscape art. And that's definitely what Justin is also referencing in his piece, but in this very contemporary way, and with this added layer of the Pinata as a technique for depicting that landscape. So you see it gives it all kinds of dimension and texture, and I think changes the context too for how we look at a landscape, in that Pinatas are we immediately think of fun and light and happy, and but there's obviously, as we see throughout the show, a lot more layers and meaning to what that Pinata signifies as a tradition. continuing on with this idea of Pinata as landscape, we included in the exhibition this, this painting by Francisco Palomares. Francisco is a Los Angeles artist who born and raised, and he uses the Pinata as a theme in a lot of his work, and usually very much commenting on, again, Latinx identity, dual identities in terms of cultures, the under treatment and issues politically of the Latinx community in our world in this day and age. And in terms of this piece, which is a great connection in terms of Justin, is referencing European master landscape tradition, English landscape tradition, and the depictions of economic classes that would have had portraiture or paintings created to capture what their ownership and largely the domination of the landscape. He is inserting his Pinata in this piece and making a very strong commentary, I'd say, on the positioning of Mexican American culture in our world in this day and age. So this juxtaposition is something that he plays with. Francisco also, I just want to mention, has a fantastic project called Palomares Boulevard, where he's imagined urban landscapes and thinks a lot about what it means to be an immigrant in Los Angeles in this day and age. And so has this kind of fantasy scape that he's created and uses as a theme in a lot of his painting projects. And he also sets up with a cart in the Arts District in LA, where he will paint on site small still life paintings, usually often fruit, because it is a fruit cart. So it's very much playing with that idea of the street vendor and bringing recognition to what that means, but instead shifting it to sell paintings of fruit versus fruit itself. And he will be part of an upcoming talk in October on the 15th. Going to move to Diana Benavidez. She is an artist based in San Diego, California, who is dual in terms of identity, in terms of Mexican American, and she has been using Pinatas throughout her sculptural work as a conceptual starting point, a technique, and also usually interweaves them with technology of some sort. So giving them that unique tweak. So this is a grouping of her border patrol cars. And you see there are remote controls besides them. And that is because these are intended to move around with remote control. And this is a piece she created in 2019, when, of course, things were at a very important moment in terms of the Trump presidency and the border wall discussion. So, which obviously is ongoing. But her way of commenting on that situation and using, as many of these artists do, the playful elements of what a Pinata is, but to make very strong political contemporary messages about our world today. So throughout this show, there's artists who are really great at finding that balance between the playfulness of the Pinata and the bittersweet truth of our modern world, ultimately. We included in this show, these are fragments of a wall that was created of Pinata blocks and installed in San Francisco right around the time of the election, the 2016 election, when the border wall was a big, it was an even stronger issue in terms of Trump presidency candidacy. And so a collaborative group of artists led by an artist named Sita Baumick created a wall installation all made of Pinata bricks, and you're able to see some images of what that looked like, also with an artist who added paint to that wall. u.s.a. Rodriguez, who created the butterflies that we talked about initially in our window, was one of the artists who contributed to this in terms of making the bricks. And it was installed, and then people got to come to that opening of that event and then break that wall apart, essentially, tear it down, smash it like a piñata should be smashed by most people's normal take on what a piñata is. Also, with Sita's work, we have in our space cameras that she created, surveillance cameras that blend in rather nicely with our space and seem to pop up on people and have been questioned if they're actually real working cameras or not. They're not working, but they are piñata cameras. And part of Sita's concept for her project was the idea of surveillance at the border wall. And she had an idea of creating a wall that was built essentially of cameras to monitor all kinds of activities that would take place there. So, and she's up in Northern California. We have in the exhibition only these two examples of piñatas that were made in Mexico. So the exhibition focuses on piñatas, art-based in piñata tradition by U.S. artists, but it was obviously very important to include the Mexican tradition of piñatas in some form in the show. And these are perfect examples of that, and also the process of migration that happens with piñatas as an idea and as objects. These were made by a group of piñateros in Baja California. The Collaborative Pinata Project is what these are a part of, and organized by a collective of filmmakers and social activists named Dignicraft, also based in Mexico. And their intention is to show ways that traditional Mexican craft is still very much alive and also under-recognized, undervalued in terms of the market, economy, and to celebrate all of those traditions. But in particular with these pieces, these were made, as I said, in Baja by a group of piñateros who migrated there from Janitzio, which is an island in the south of Mexico, essentially Michoacan. And their cultural tradition, they are purépecha, and these are traditional costumes that are typical. And this is an island, and so their economy normally, before coming to Baja, is based on the ocean fishing economy. That's a big part of life there. So this is an homage to where they originate, their history, their own tradition. So you see the canoe, typical, and the net for the fishermen in our boat, and the woman in the traditional dress. So we're going to move on to the other portion of our show. Going to begin with a piece by Amaret Crespo. And Amaret is an artist here in LA who has a relatively new, started within the last 5 years, a piñata making business. And this is an example of the kinds of piñatas that she makes that are very detailed and just wonderful celebrations of culture. And she goes by Party Girl Piñatas. This particular dancer, this is her folklorico dancer, is actually really an homage to her mother's culture and regional culture. This is the traditional costume, and the dance that would be performed is actually something that her daughter now is a part of a troupe and studying that dance. So it's a very personal piñata. It's very much also pushing the boundaries of what piñatas are in terms of not smashing them, but showing how much can be done with this paper process, essentially, and questioning what changes things when you make piñatas that are meant to be kept as sculptural objects. So behind us is a super fun, glimmery piece by Yesenia Prieto and her partners at Pinata Design Studio. They're based here in Los Angeles, and we're going to be looking at another piece of theirs. This piece is called All That Glitters, and it's intended to be a more permanent decorative piece. And this is, I think, an interesting piece in that these geometric shapes, these diamond shapes, almost look like Chinese lanterns. And I think it's a great way to think about the Chinese origins of piñatas and drawing back on that history a bit. So I wanted to mention our Piñata Memory Project. So part of what became really apparent in organizing the show is the lack of documentation of piñatas as a tradition, the lack of their presence in cultural institutions, and even, you know, the history, the anthropology. There's very little that exists that's been documenting what piñatas signify anywhere, and particularly in the U.S., as it's a more and more widespread tradition going back many, many decades, of course. So we are inviting everyone to share with us their personal stories of favorite piñatas and experiences with piñatas over time. And we're doing this as kind of a collective history project. So please feel free to email us or send us your particular memories in any way you'd like. You can email us at center@craftinamerica.org, for instance. And if you come in, you're able to write down your own memory and attach it to our piñata here. We're also collecting images as well. And it's just been a great way to hear about stories of piñatas that were often historically made still of ceramics. As far as we know, ceramic piñatas were pretty common at least into the 1960s, and then they switched to being made of paper for a number of reasons. One, much safer than having ceramic shards flying all over the place. Two, probably a little more accessible in terms of material to make them out of paper. And malleable and less heavy, and a number of reasons why that switch happened. But please, we invite you to share with us any of your history and stories with piñatas. In the window, the large skeletal hand that you're looking at, this is another piece by Yesenia Prieto and her piñata business here in LA, again, is the Pinata Design Studio. And this piece is called In God We Trust. So Yesenia is a third generation piñata maker here in LA. And she learned from her family and has really built up her business from that starting point. And Yesenia has been very outspoken about the ways that piñata makers have been very much unequally compensated for their labor and thinking about ways that it's very hard for pinata makers to compete with mass market. And these are very much handmade objects, no matter what. But thinking about, you know, the price points for pinatas, the amount of labor that goes into them, the amount of time, the amount of creativity, skills, design skills, the number of skills that it involves, everything from model making to color design to the paper mache aspect. So it's a complicated process that again, we haven't really fully looked at as a craft or an art for that matter, and that's for a number of reasons. So Yesenia wanted to shed some light on that in terms of the penny that's being held in terms of that piece as a really strong message for thinking about what handcraft signifies in this day and age and how we value craft. Behind me is a piece by Lorena Robledo, who has another pinata making business here in Los Angeles. Lorena makes all kinds, like Yesenia and like many of the pinata companies here, particularly in Los Angeles, many branded large-scale pinatas that are meant often more as decorative, as maybe permanent sculptures or sculptures that are used at various events and still used really like focal points within those events, as we see pinatas would be, whether they're being smashed at a party or otherwise, but making kind of anchoring a space with a pinata in terms of all kinds of events for Hollywood, and the entertainment industry, to private events and so on. And like many of the pinata makers here in LA, they are working for commissions that are all over the country at this point. LA is definitely a big hub for pinata making, in addition to being a hub for imported pinatas from Mexico. And I'll talk about that in just a second. This pinata is her Alebrije, and those are a traditional Mexican craft form, not normally made on this scale, usually made much smaller. This is a large paper mache piece with all kinds of detail. And again, back to this idea of pinata as fantasy and the possibilities that you can shape a pinata into any kind of sculptural form, any kind of creature, much like what Roberto does, and that is captured in that object, and usually then displayed in some sort of festive occasion, celebration of some kind. So back to all those core ideas. For this painting, another piece, which is by Francisco Palomares. This piece is called Pinata y Dulces, which is pinata and sweets. And this, I think, is a great symbol of, and Francisco's interpretation, much like many of the artists in the show, of the pinata as being this object that has this surface and structure that's bold and vivid and fun, but inside, what is normally inside a pinata? Sweets, candies, and that's what they've been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. You smash them, and what you find inside is the real sweetness. And so Francisco reads that as a perfect metaphor for Mexican culture, for Chicano culture, that you smash through. Yes, the exterior has its fun appeal and beauty, but it's what's inside that is where the sweetness really is. And so a really strong statement. And again, you know, he's placing his pinata, much like we're doing with the show, in a different kind of context, or completely out of context in this case, just floating on the wall. And so again, it's taking a step back from looking at pinatas that we see at birthday parties and that we've had at our own parties or buy for our children's parties, and looking at them from this angle of what they signify as art objects for this moment in time. Playing off of Francisco's painting, we have the traditional burro piñata that's hanging up here in our space. And this was included in the show because it's our main homage to, first of all, a very traditional piñata shape and sculpture, sculptural form. The donkey is a form that's been around for decades and decades as the classic piñata. I did want to mention that part of the origins of the piñata, we talk about back in China, that there is theory that among the celebrations that were happening in China that may have been the source of inspiration for piñatas to travel elsewhere in the world. The Chinese would have a celebration where they would make an earthenware, a ceramic ox that would be shattered during these the New Year celebrations or other kinds of holidays. And so if you think about the link between breaking that ceramic ox in China to the burro, the donkey, being a traditional piñata form, there's definitely some very interesting links to be made. And it's just strictly a matter of documenting truly in some sort of text sources where that link comes from. In any case, clearly ideas that existed in different parts of the world and for many, many centuries at this point in time. The burro is still a classic piñata form, obviously, and but adapted. And this piece came from the Pinata district in Los Angeles. And I did want to note that Los Angeles has its own Pinata district, one of the only places in the world that's a designated Pinata district. So we have several blocks of stores, storefronts downtown in Los Angeles here for this designated area where all these shops just are filled to the gills with piñatas of all different shapes and sizes and piñata supplies, from candies to sticks for batting piñatas, and a mix of piñatas coming from Mexico, largely. Many of the shops carry more piñatas that are imported from Mexico than made locally. So this was hard to come by a piñata that was actually made here, just in terms of what's included in the shops within the LA Pinata district. Most of the piñata makers tend to have shops elsewhere in town at this point, but just a massive, massive market, and also a main distribution center for piñatas across the entire country. So they're imported, brought here, and then dispersed. Wholesale happens there. So it's this mini part of the economy, essentially, here in LA, but that has impact nationally or internationally for that matter. So moving along, Amaranth Crespo, the same Pinatera who made the Folklorico dancer, created this piece recently. This is a Zoom computer. And this piece, I think, has a lot of resonance for any of us at this point in time. It's particularly a Zoom school, a Zoom classroom. And she made this because her daughter said at the end of her hybrid remote learning experience last year, or some point during, that she had to make a Zoom computer and let her smash it because she was so completely fed up with remote learning. So in a lot of cases, piñatas have been a family project, a family business, something that's passed down for generations, but something that everybody pitches in to contribute to. And I just thought this was wonderful that the idea came from her daughter and their shared exhaustion over everything that we've all experienced over this past stretch of time, and capturing it in terms of the Zoom computer piñata was was just such a fun take on what piñatas can be. And I think it's also something that we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, shows how piñatas have this long-term tradition and history, but are constantly being reinvented and readapted to comment on and serve and echo what's happening in our world just so powerfully, and how easily it's a form that adapts and responds to culture. So the next piece, the greenhouse with the very sad face, is a piece by Giovanni Valderas. He is an artist in Texas who, Dallas area, who creates piñatas he uses the piñata format in a number of ways in his work. And this is part of a series called Casita Triste. So he has placed these piñatas, similar piñatas like this example, all over his area in Dallas, and usually putting them on sites where there's going to be high-end real estate development coming. So empty lots that are slated for development. He'll plop them down kind of guerrilla style as interventions on site, and really just see how people, the community, respond to them. And playing with this idea of the lack of affordable housing, which is certainly an issue increasingly all over the country, in various places, more so than others, but speaks to a lot of us. And Giovanni does this play with the idea of piñatas and this very saccharine, the bold color. It looks very playful and simple, like a silly character, but plays with that angle to make this very strong, ultimately political statement. And he has all kinds of hilarious stories of what people have done and how they've responded to his casitas when he's placed them out in the community. And in addition, I wanted to also mention that, so this use of the piñata as a very political tool is something that's another element very much of this exhibition. And beyond that, in terms of Giovanni, he has been active, not just as an artist, but actually ran for city council, and which I think was rare, exceptional, and phenomenal to hear of artists actually running for office, and the ways that artists can make an impact through their art as commentary, but as a direct influence on our government. So he has a very interesting artistic practice. Going to move over to this corner. This piece is a piece by Mari Carson, who's a Northern California artist. She's actually a costume designer, trained in architecture, and you are looking at a uterus. And Mari made her first uterus piñata when she was diagnosed with cancer and had a hysterectomy. So this was, again, this way that piñatas have this bittersweet but yet playful element to them, but this way that they can tell people stories and that we get to also interact with them. What she did was she made her first uterus piñata for this moment when she had her hysterectomy, and she had a big party where she invited people over, and then they smashed it, and she filled it with all kinds of related kinds of objects, and condoms and tampons. And I think it has a very strong message about feminism, about body, and like many of these artists, is really looking at piñatas as these pieces that are intended to be smashed, and what that can mean in terms of pushing your artwork into a message, whether that's about Chicano identity or border policy or personal body politics. And now she sells them to women across the country, probably many of whom are also having hysterectomies for any number of reasons. This is a pinata by, I'm gonna let you see the face of that a little bit. These are two more pinatas that are very much about popular culture. The Flaming Hot Cheetos box, complete with its nutrition information, and it's such a popular snack. And Selena, the Selena shimmery glimmery pinata, and a perfect link also with a group of pinatas that we have nearby by Ana Serrano. And so all of these are pinatas that are tributes to icons of Mexican culture, essentially. We've got people like, and you're probably looking at some images of them up close. We have the singer, performer, multi-talented Irma Serrano. We have Walter Mercado, the psychic, and we have Cantinflas and a number of other characters. So Ana with this piece, and they have excellent detail, excellent facial expression on this very small scale version of them, is really paying a tribute to all these icons and celebrating all of them in this very fun, playful way, and using this oddly durable yet fragile and ephemeral material of paper, and commenting on their legacies and their celebrity. As we come to a close of the exhibition, this show, in putting this show together, this really started almost 4 years ago as a concept, pre-COVID, pre the way the world has completely changed. And over this course of time, the pinata really, I think, has come to signify something different over this last stretch of time, when people were not able to gather for parties like we always had been. And two of the pinatas that are back here are related to COVID. We've got the vaccine that's made by Elizabeth Palacios, who's in Florida, and the COVID virus pinata, which is another piece by Lorena Robledo. And I think it's again, the way that pinatas are able to epitomize everything about our world in any given moment in time. And also the idea of, do we make pinatas that are of things we love, things we hate? What does that mean? There's the last stretch of time, all of a sudden we've seen a lot of pinatas made of politicians more and more over the past decade or so. And so is smashing that pinata a release because you dislike a person, or is it that you love these people and it's just a playful tribute to how sweet they are, and in your own personal love of these people? In terms of the COVID, I think it's clearly the idea that we make pinatas and that smashing them is this moment of like release and catharsis, and I think it really just shows the way that the makers are able to use this art form with such creativity and and the way it's outspoken in terms of capturing who we are through very pure, kind of very vivid color imagery. And then of course the piece on the back, it's another piece by Giovanni Valderas, and the phrase is slang and often misinterpreted, but meaning there's no problem, and obviously meant with a bit of irony. Like a lot of the work in the show, there's so many layers to the messages that it's not just what the surface means, but there's much more depth if you dig through and get there. So that is the brief overview of what's in the exhibition, and I'd welcome any questions at this point. And give us just a moment. The word pinata, great question. There's, again, like all of this, it's very much theorized speculation, but we believe, so Marco Polo goes to China in the 13th century, comes back to northern Italy. He's in Venice, he's in Genoa, he's Venetian originally. And in Genoa, there is also a tradition that, again, we don't know if it's that he brought this back there or if it was simultaneously in existence. Piñata, piña is pine cone or also pine nut in Italian, and it's spelled GN instead of the N with the tilde. But in Genoa at that time, instead of how it was used in China for New Year's, it was piñatas started being used as ceramic vessels. They would often be filled with candy. They would often be filled in the region of Genoa. They would be filled with candies that were pine nut based, which, not to go too far into this, but pesto is usually made with pine nuts. That's a traditional Genovese dish. So they would make various kinds of pine nut based sweets and treats, fill these ceramic vessels, these jars, and jugs with them, and decorate them, and then smash them, usually either around the time of Christmas, so starting that posada tradition that happens later in Mexico, but also for Lent, so which is more common in Italy, that they're used for Lent. So that's what we believe is the origin of piñata. But also sometimes in Italy they're referred to as pentolaccia, which is more like vessel. So that, I hope, answers that in the speculative nutshell. This is not the first exhibit, but to our knowledge, there was a show in New Mexico several years ago, I think in 2018, 2017. But beyond that, not something that's been represented, possibly in Chicago at some point in time. This is the first in Los Angeles. And I believe the first to look at Pinata from these different kinds of angles. And again, even very little to find happening even in Mexico in terms of proper exhibitions. And putting the show together, we reached out to a number of scholars and art historians and anthropologists, and it's really, really hard to find an expert anywhere. There are competitions, there are contests. So, it's the ongoing tradition, but looking at it from this angle, looking at the history, less of that has happened.
When you purchase a Pinata in the Los Angeles area, are there markets to know where it's from or the artist made it?
Yes, when you purchase Pinatas here in the US, there's usually some sort of sticker on the imported ones. Hecho in Mexico is usually a sticker you can find somewhere on the Pinata. And beyond that, there are different Pinata making techniques that you find more commonly in Mexican Pinatas, which are, they're beautiful and very detailed and imaginative. And so the fringe tends to be cut slightly differently. They can be a little more dense, the fringe, usually, than ones made in the US. Also, interestingly, the Pinatas that are made more commercially in the US often are the character Pinatas. So, you can't import anything with a character, like a Disney character, let's say, from Mexico would be a problem to be importing it because of licenses and all of that. So, so those tend to be made in the US. So that's kind of a way to know what's made there versus here. But then, in terms of finding the piñateros that are based in the US, at this point, the internet is everyone's friend, and they do exist, and support them. And they're capable of making incredible piñatas of anything you can imagine. And I've heard from, the makers involved in this show that they've received pretty much requests for anything imaginable and been able to make them.
Where is the Pinata
The Pinata district in Los Angeles is mainly on 9th Street, close to, I think it's Central, I want to say. It's easily Googleable, but it's 9th Street, and it's several blocks, and it's a super fun area to walk around. Super tons of action and so much to see, so fun for kids. There's just shops and shops filled with imported Mexican candy. I mean, a mixed candy from wherever, all over, toys, and all kinds of things that you can stuff a piñata with, to party supplies overall of any kind. So it's a great place to know about. Okay, I think we have come to a close in terms of questions, and it's been so fun to get to talk about this exhibition. Hopefully some of you will get to see it in person. Please visit us or visit the exhibition again on craftinamerica.org. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you to all the artists and all the piñata makers out there for advancing this craft.